When a poor janitor had the chance to take care of her entire family's expenses with one shortcut, she chose to trust in kindness instead, and it led her to a life she never thought possible. Grace wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her calloused fingers brushing against a loose strand of hair. The corporate office she cleaned every night was eerily still, the only sound the rhythmic squeak of her mop against the polished floor. Through the expansive glass windows, the city glittered in the distance, a view she could only admire from afar. "This is for Grandma. This is for Lucy," she whispered to herself, her voice barely breaking the hush. It was a mantra she repeated to push past the fatigue. Grace worked harder than most, not for ambition, but for survival. Her grandmother's medical bills were mounting, and her younger brother depended on her to keep their crumbling world together. Miles above her, in a corner office bathed in blue light, Nathan Calloway stared at the skyline, his fingers absent-mindedly spinning a diamond ring on the desk. It was his mother's, her most prized possession, and now the only anchor in his unraveling life. His company, a once thriving empire, teetered on the brink of collapse. Every call from the boardroom was another blow, every investor meeting another reminder of failure. He leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the words his mother often said, "This ring isn't just a jewel, it's a reminder. In our darkest times, we hold on to hope." Nathan had always believed that, but lately, hope felt like a hollow promise. Grace and Nathan were worlds apart, yet they existed within the same fragile bubble of struggles and responsibilities. She was the invisible force keeping the office clean. He was the distant figure atop a collapsing empire. They had nothing in common, or so it seemed, until one night fate decided to intertwine their lives in a way neither could have expected. As Grace dragged her cart down the hallway, humming softly, Nathan stormed out of the boardroom, distracted by a heated argument over the company's future. His hands, clenched in frustration, tugged at his hair before shoving deep into his pockets. He didn't notice the diamond ring slip from his finger and land on the carpet. Hours later, Grace found it. She stopped mid-step, her mop clattering softly against the cart. The diamond sparkled under the overhead light, impossibly brilliant against the dull gray carpet. She crouched, her fingers hesitating before picking it up. Its weight startled her, not just the physical weight, but the gravity of its value. This ring could erase her struggles in an instant. The thought whispered temptations she didn't dare give voice to. She glanced at the security camera in the corner, feeling its unblinking eye on her. What would they see, she wondered. What kind of person am I? She tucked the ring into her pocket, her chest tight with conflicted thoughts. She needed time to decide. The hall stretched before her like a path leading to countless outcomes, each one harder to face than the last. Grace adjusted the straps of her worn backpack as she trudged home after her shift. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rumble of passing cars. Her small apartment stood at the edge of a crumbling neighborhood, its peeling paint and rusted railings mirroring the fragility of her life. Inside, the soft hum of the oxygen machine greeted her. Her grandmother lay asleep in the corner, her frail frame barely rising with each shallow breath. Lucy, Grace's 10-year-old brother, had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, his math homework still unfinished. She gently kissed his forehead and draped a blanket over his shoulders. Grace didn't sleep much. Between her late-night shifts and caring for her family, rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her dreams weren't about wealth or luxury, they were simpler. Keeping a roof over their heads, seeing Lucy graduate, and hearing her grandmother laugh again. She clung to these dreams like a lifeline, but the weight of reality pressed harder every day. The eviction notice pinned to the fridge was a constant reminder that time was running out. In a sleek penthouse miles away, Nathan paced the length of his office. The skyline before him gleamed like a taunt, a constant reminder of what he stood to lose. His company, Calloway Industries, was in shambles. The financial crisis had gutted their profits, and Nathan had spent the last few months scrambling to keep investors from walking away. But it wasn't just numbers that haunted him. It was the weight of his family's legacy. The diamond ring on his desk caught the light. its brilliance undiminished by the chaos around it. His mother had given it to him years ago, her words still etched in his mind. "When the world feels dark, Nathan, hold on to this. It's a symbol of hope, of perseverance. And don't forget, kindness matters most." Lately, Nathan had questioned those words. The world he inhabited was ruthless, filled with backstabbing colleagues and greedy investors. Kindness felt like a weakness in a world driven by profit margins. He clenched the ring tightly, as if trying to draw strength from it. What would Mom say now? Grace often caught glimpses of Nathan during her shifts, though only from a distance. To her, he was a figure of untouchable authority, a man who moved through life with confidence and power. She never imagined someone like him would notice someone like her. Nathan, on the other hand, rarely noticed anyone outside his immediate circle, but as his life spiraled further into chaos, he found himself questioning the people around him. Greed and dishonesty seemed to be the norm, leaving him disillusioned with the world he had once worked so hard to conquer. Both were trapped. Grace by her circumstances, Nathan by his expectations. They lived parallel lives, unaware that they were on a collision course set by fate. The night it all changed, Grace was scrubbing the boardroom floor when she noticed Nathan storm out. His jaw was clenched, his tie loosened, and frustration radiated from him like heat. She quickly turned her attention back to her mop, not wanting to be noticed. Unbeknownst to either of them, the diamond ring slipped from Nathan's pocket as he walked down the hallway. It landed softly on the carpet, its sparkle muted under the fluorescent lights. Hours later, Grace found it. Her shift was nearly over, and her feet ached from hours of standing. She moved her mop aside when something caught her eye, a glint of light that didn't belong. Her breath hitched as she crouched to pick it up. The diamond was flawless, its facets catching the light in a way that seemed almost unreal. For a moment, she simply stared, the enormity of its value sinking in. Grace's mind raced as she held the ring. She thought of her grandmother's medication, the overdue rent, and the utilities that were one missed payment away from being shut off. This ring could solve everything, but the thought of keeping it made her stomach twist. She imagined Lucy's face if he ever found out. What kind of example would I be setting? Still, the temptation was undeniable. Her fingers tightened around the ring as a battle waged within her. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to dream. A life where her family wasn't struggling, where the eviction notice wasn't taped to the fridge, where her grandmother's breathing came easily. But the dream was fleeting. Her grandmother's words came back to her. "Grace, we may have little, but we always have our integrity. Never trade that for anything." With a trembling hand, Grace slipped the ring into her pocket, not to keep, but to protect. She couldn't make the decision now, not with her emotions so raw. She needed time to think. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, her reflection in the glass doors seemed to mock her. The ring felt impossibly heavy in her pocket, a symbol of the impossible choice before her. The next morning, Grace sat in the break room, the ring resting in her palm. She hadn't slept, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Her shift supervisor called for her to start her rounds, but she lingered for a moment longer. Taking a deep breath, she clenched her fist around the ring and headed for the lost and found department. When she reached the counter, her legs felt like lead. The clerk barely looked up as she placed the ring down. "This was left behind," Grace said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The clerk nodded, scribbling a note without a second glance. "Thanks." Grace turned and walked away quickly, her heart pounding. She didn't need recognition or thanks. She just needed to forget the temptation she had almost given into. But as she walked back to her cart, she couldn't help but wonder, did I do the right thing? Days later, Nathan sat in his office, staring at the diamond ring in his hand. Relief washed over him as his assistant explained that someone had turned it in anonymously. "Who?" he asked, his voice sharp with curiosity. The assistant shrugged. "No idea. They didn't leave a name." Nathan's mind raced. Who would return something so valuable without expecting anything in return? He ordered a review of the building's security footage, determined to find the person responsible. Hours of grainy footage eventually revealed the answer: a janitor. Her face was partially obscured, but her uniform and posture were unmistakable. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening on the ring. Someone with so little had done what so many others in his life wouldn't. It was humbling, and it sparked something in him he hadn't felt in years. Nathan couldn't get the janitor out of his mind. Who was this person who had returned the ring without claiming credit? He began observing the late-night staff discreetly, reviewing the footage until he identified her. A young woman with tired eyes but a purposeful gait. It wasn't long before he noticed her during his late-night office hours. She moved through the building with quiet efficiency, her expression distant yet calm. Nathan realized he had never paid attention to the people who worked tirelessly in the shadows, keeping his company's wheels turning. If you are enjoying the story till now, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue. One evening, as he watched her adjust a loose chair leg in the break room, he felt a pang of guilt. Here was someone whose honesty had outshone the high-powered executives he dealt with daily, yet she remained invisible to everyone around her. But what struck him most was the whisper he caught as she passed by. For Grandma. For Lucy. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Nathan made a decision. He needed to learn more about this woman, not out of curiosity alone, but because she had reminded him of values he had all but abandoned. Grace's days remained a blur of exhaustion and sacrifice. At work, she continued her unnoticed acts of kindness, leaving notes of encouragement on lockers, taping broken desk drawers, and sneaking extra sugar packets to the overnight guards. It was her way of holding on to humanity in a world that seemed to demand she abandon it. Her struggles, however, deepened. One night, she received a call from her landlord as she finished wiping down the break room counter. "This is your last warning, Grace. The rent is overdue. I can't give you another extension." Her heart sank as she mumbled an apology, her voice cracking. The pressure was suffocating, but she couldn't let her family see her fear. She had to stay strong. For them. As she walked back to her cart, she spotted a leftover sandwich in the office fridge. After a moment of hesitation, she left it in the guard's booth with a quick note. "You've had a long night. Take care." She didn't need thanks. These small gestures were her way of giving what little she could. Nathan's quiet observations began to reveal more than he expected. He saw the exhaustion in Grace's movements, the way she lingered by the vending machines as if debating whether to spend her last dollar. He noticed her stealing brief glances at family photos taped inside her locker. It was during one of these observations that he overheard a passing comment from another janitor. "She's always running herself into the ground. I don't know how she does it," the coworker muttered. "The girl's got a heart of gold, but you can see she's struggling." Nathan felt his chest tighten. He had spent years surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet this woman, who had every reason to give up, chose to rise above her circumstances. She didn't just clean the office, she gave it life. Nathan knew he couldn't stay silent. Grace's honesty and perseverance deserved recognition, not just for what she had done for him, but for who she was. He decided to use the upcoming company recognition event to honor her. The annual event was usually a bland affair, a chance for department heads to pat themselves on the back. But Nathan saw an opportunity to change that. This year, he would tell Grace's story. He drafted his speech late one night, struggling to find the right words. How could he describe someone like Grace? How could he do justice to her integrity without embarrassing her? As the date approached, he felt a mix of anticipation and doubt. Would Grace see this as a kind gesture or an intrusion into her life? Meanwhile, Grace's life was reaching a breaking point. The eviction notice on her fridge now bore bold red letters. Final notice. She spent hours calling social service offices, trying to secure aid for her grandmother's medical needs, but the responses were always the same. There's a long wait list. Her breaking point came one night when Lucy tugged at her sleeve. "Grace, can we go to the fair this weekend? It's just a few blocks away. They have cotton candy and rides." Grace froze, her heart breaking at the innocence in his request. "Maybe next time, sweetheart," she said softly, ruffling his hair. Lucy nodded, but his quiet, "okay," was like a dagger to her chest. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, her hands folded tightly. She prayed silently, not for miracles, but for the strength to keep going. The company recognition event arrived, and Grace tried to stay as far out of sight as possible. She had cleaned the banquet hall earlier that morning, ensuring everything sparkled for the executives and staff who would attend. She never expected her name to be called. Nathan stood on stage, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He began recounting a story that had deeply impacted him, the story of a lost diamond ring and the person who chose honesty over personal gain. He didn't mention her name at first, but as he spoke, Grace realized with growing dread that he was talking about her. "And this act," Nathan concluded, his eyes scanning the room, "restored my faith in people. In a world where greed and dishonesty often prevail, this person chose to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy." He paused, his gaze locking onto Grace. "Grace Thompson, please come up." Grace's breath caught. The room erupted in applause as her coworkers turned to look at her, some with expressions of surprise, others with admiration. She hesitated, her hands shaking, before slowly making her way to the stage. Nathan extended his hand as she approached, his expression warm and genuine. "Grace," he said softly, "thank you for reminding us what integrity looks like." The applause grew louder, and Grace felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to shrink away, but a part of her felt a quiet pride. For once, her struggles were seen. As she stepped off the stage, she thought, "Maybe I did the right thing after all." Grace returned to her routine the day after the event, her emotions a tangled web of pride and unease. The applause, Nathan's words, and the respect she had seen in her coworkers' eyes were a stark contrast to the life waiting for her at home. The eviction notice was still taped to the fridge. Her grandmother's cough sounded worse that morning, and Lucy's shoes had new holes in them. Grace knew that no amount of applause could pay the bills or keep the roof over their heads. At work, a few employees stopped to congratulate her. "That was really brave of you," one said. Grace smiled politely, but didn't linger. She couldn't afford to let praise distract her from the reality of her struggles. That night, as she scrubbed the break room floor, she whispered to herself, "Just a little longer. I can hold on a little longer." But how long could she keep going? Nathan couldn't stop thinking about Grace after the event. Her story had sparked something within him, a desire to reevaluate his own life and the culture of the company he led. He sat in his office late one night, scrolling through employee records and company policies. The numbers told a story he hadn't wanted to see before: low wages, high turnover, and a lack of programs to support the people who worked hardest. For years, he had been so focused on profits that he had ignored the people who made those profits possible. Grace's honesty had reminded him of his mother's words. "Kindness matters most, Nathan. Don't ever forget that." He realized he had forgotten, but it wasn't too late to change. Nathan decided to start small. He asked HR to compile a list of employees struggling with medical expenses or housing issues. Quietly, he set up a fund to help them, starting with Grace. A week later, Grace received an envelope in her locker. At first, she thought it was a mistake. There was no name on it, just her locker number scrawled in neat handwriting. Inside was a note. "You inspire more people than you realize. This is a small token to say thank you. Use it however you need." Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded the rest of the contents. A check for $10,000. Her knees nearly buckled as she sank onto the nearest bench, tears streaming down her face. She reread the note, her mind racing. Who could have done this? She wanted to refuse it, but the weight of her circumstances crushed any arguments her pride could muster. That evening, she paid her overdue rent, bought Lucy a new pair of shoes, and scheduled a doctor's appointment for her grandmother. And for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Nathan watched from afar as Grace's demeanor began to change. She still worked tirelessly, but there was a new lightness to her step, a faint smile that hadn't been there before. He felt no need to take credit for the anonymous gift. This wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the right thing, just as Grace had done for him. But he couldn't ignore the growing admiration he felt for her. Grace's resilience, kindness, and integrity were unlike anything he had seen in his world of power and privilege. For the first time in years, Nathan felt a spark of hope, not just for his company, but for himself. Just as things seemed to stabilize, Grace's grandmother's health took a sudden turn. One night, Grace returned home to find her struggling to breathe, her hands clutching the arm of the chair as she gasped for air. Panic surged through Grace as she called 911, her voice shaking. "Please hurry," she begged. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to Grace's spiraling thoughts. Lucy clung to her side, his wide eyes filled with fear. At the hospital, the doctor delivered a grim diagnosis: pneumonia. "She's stable for now," he said, "but her recovery will depend on round-the-clock care." Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. She would do whatever it took to ensure her grandmother's recovery, even if it meant taking on more shifts or sacrificing what little rest she had. Nathan learned about Grace's situation through a coworker. When he heard about her grandmother's hospitalization, he couldn't stay silent any longer. Grace had done so much for others. It was time someone stepped up for her. He called her into his office the next day, a rare occurrence that made Grace's stomach churn with anxiety. She stepped in hesitantly, her hands folded in front of her. "Grace, please sit," Nathan said, his tone unusually gentle. She obeyed, her heart pounding. "Am I in trouble?" Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I heard about your grandmother," he began. "I'm sorry you're going through this." Grace blinked, stunned that he even knew. "Thank you," she whispered. "I want to help," he continued. "The company has a new fund to support employees in difficult circumstances. It's anonymous, but I want you to know it's there for you. Whatever you need, hospital bills, medications, consider it covered." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "I can't. I don't want to take advantage." "You're not taking advantage," Nathan interrupted firmly. "You've earned this, Grace, more than anyone." His sincerity left her speechless. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a janitor, but as a person. Grace accepted the help, though reluctantly at first. Her grandmother's health began to improve with the proper care, and for the first time in years, the shadow of constant fear lifted from Grace's life. Nathan, meanwhile, found himself drawn to Grace in ways he hadn't expected. Her honesty and strength had reminded him of his mother, and he couldn't ignore the growing admiration he felt. One evening, as Grace finished her shift, she found Nathan waiting by the elevators. He smiled faintly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Can I walk you out?" he asked. Grace hesitated, but nodded. As they stepped into the crisp night air, a comfortable silence settled between them. "You've changed the way I see things," Nathan admitted. "The way I see people. Thank you for that." Grace glanced at him, her cheeks flushing. "I was just doing what felt right," she said softly. "Exactly," Nathan replied, "and that's rare." As they reached the street, Grace felt something stir in her chest, a spark of hope she hadn't dared feel in years. Maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to change. For the first time in years, Grace's life had found a fragile balance. With her grandmother receiving proper care and the eviction notice no longer looming over her, the relentless weight on her chest began to ease. Her days still started before dawn and ended long after the city lights dimmed, but the crushing urgency had softened. She even found herself smiling more. Whether it was at Lucy's silly jokes or the sight of her grandmother sitting up in bed, her health steadily improving. At work, whispers of her recognition during the company event still lingered. Some colleagues looked at her with newfound respect, others with jealousy. Grace, however, stayed focused on her duties, refusing to let the attention distract her. But she couldn't ignore Nathan's quiet presence. He seemed to appear more often during her shifts, always with a kind word or a genuine question about her family. Grace wasn't sure what to make of it. He was the CEO, a figure far removed from her world, yet he spoke to her as if they were equals. Why does he care so much? She often wondered. Nathan found himself seeking out Grace during his long, late-night hours at the office. Her unwavering kindness and strength had sparked something he hadn't felt in years: hope. She reminded him of the values his mother had taught him, values he feared he had lost in the cutthroat world of business. He began to notice the small things about her, the way she hummed under her breath while working, her quiet smile as she passed security guards, the way she tucked stray strands of hair behind her ear when she thought no one was watching. But Nathan also saw the toll her life had taken on her, the shadows under her eyes, the weariness in her posture, and the moments of hesitation when someone complimented her, as if she didn't believe she deserved it. One evening, as he watched her carefully clean the glass doors of the boardroom, he felt a pang of guilt. Here was a woman who had every reason to be bitter, yet she chose honesty and kindness every single day. Though her life had stabilized, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The anonymous check, the support from Nathan, it was all too much. She worried about becoming dependent on others, about losing the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. "Why do they care?" she confided in her grandmother one evening, sitting by her bedside. "I'm just a janitor." Her grandmother reached for her hand, her grip weak but steady. "You're more than that, Grace. You always have been. People see the good in you because it shines so brightly, even when you don't notice it yourself." Grace blinked back tears, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind as she returned to work the next day. But the doubt lingered. Could she truly accept help without losing herself? Nathan realized he couldn't ignore his growing feelings for Grace. Her strength, humility, and integrity had reignited something he thought was lost: a belief in people, in goodness, in second chances. But how could he approach her without overwhelming her? Nathan knew that his position as CEO came with power dynamics that might make Grace uncomfortable. He decided to take a risk. One evening, as Grace finished mopping the main hallway, Nathan approached her. His hands were in his pockets, his demeanor more hesitant than usual. "Grace," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Do you have a moment?" Grace straightened, clutching the mop handle like a lifeline. "Of course, Mr. Calloway." "Please," he said with a faint smile, "call me Nathan." The request caught her off guard, but she nodded. "Okay, Nathan." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about everything you've done, for me, for this company. You've reminded me of what really matters. I was wondering if you'd join me for dinner sometime. Nothing formal, just a chance to talk." Grace's eyes widened, her heart racing. She couldn't tell if he was being genuine or if this was some elaborate gesture of gratitude. "I'm not sure," she began, but Nathan raised a hand gently. "No pressure," he said quickly. "I just think you deserve to be heard, Grace. That's all." Grace hesitated, her mind racing with doubts, but there was something sincere in his tone, something that made her want to say yes. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, relief washing over him. "That's all I ask." That evening, Grace told her grandmother about Nathan's invitation. The older woman's eyes sparkled with mischief despite her frailty. "And what's holding you back?" she asked. "I don't belong in his world," Grace said, wringing her hands. "He's everything I'm not." Her grandmother shook her head. "You're wrong, Grace. He sees something in you that even you don't see. Don't let fear keep you from living." Lucy, overhearing the conversation, chimed in with a grin. "You should go. Maybe he'll take you to one of those fancy places with tiny food." Grace laughed despite herself, but the doubts still lingered. She didn't want to get her hopes up, only to have them come crashing down. 2 days later, Grace found herself sitting across from Nathan at a cozy, quiet restaurant. not the intimidatingly luxurious setting she had feared. Nathan had chosen a place that felt warm and unpretentious, a reflection of the person he was slowly becoming. They talked for hours, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine conversation. Nathan listened intently as Grace spoke about her family, her dreams, and her struggles. In turn, he shared stories of his mother, of the values she had instilled in him, and of the ways Grace had reminded him of those lessons. By the end of the evening, Grace felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, she didn't feel like a janitor or a charity case. She felt seen. As Nathan walked her to her car, he paused, his expression thoughtful. "Grace, thank you for trusting me enough to share your story." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you for listening." Nathan hesitated for a moment before saying, "This isn't just about gratitude, Grace. You've made me realize what's been missing in my life." Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she said nothing, unsure of what to do with his words. Over the weeks that followed, Nathan and Grace grew closer. Their conversations deepened, their understanding of each other expanding with every interaction. Grace began to see Nathan not as a distant CEO, but as a man searching for meaning in a world that often felt empty. Nathan, in turn, saw Grace as a beacon of resilience and kindness. She wasn't just a reflection of his mother's values, she was her own person, someone who inspired him to be better. But their growing connection didn't come without challenges. Grace struggled with self-doubt, constantly questioning whether she was worthy of Nathan's attention, and Nathan faced skepticism from those around him, who couldn't understand why he would spend so much time with someone so far removed from his world. Their bond was tested at every turn, but they both knew one thing: they were better together. Nathan stood in his office, staring at the diamond ring on his desk. It had always been a symbol of his mother's wisdom and the values she held dear. Now it represented something more, a chance to honor her legacy by embracing the lessons Grace had unknowingly taught him. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Schedule a meeting with HR," he said firmly. "I want to discuss changes to our employee support programs." The call wasn't just about the company, it was about Grace. Her honesty, resilience, and quiet acts of kindness had shown Nathan what his mother had always meant by kindness matters most. He wanted to create an environment where people like Grace were supported, valued, and given the chance to thrive. But Nathan's plans extended beyond the office. As he thought about everything Grace had done, for her family, for the company, and for him, he knew he couldn't let her slip away. Meanwhile, Grace was wrestling with her own thoughts. Her growing connection with Nathan had brought a light into her life that she hadn't felt in years, but it also brought fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in his world. "He's kind and thoughtful," she confided to her grandmother one evening. "But what happens when he realizes I'm just me?" Her grandmother smiled gently, her voice soft but firm. "Grace, he already knows who you are. That's why he cares. Don't let your doubts steal this chance at happiness." Grace nodded, but her heart still wavered. She wanted to trust Nathan, but trusting herself felt harder. One evening, as Grace finished her shift, she found Nathan waiting by the elevators. His suit was immaculate, but his expression was nervous, almost boyish. "Grace," he began, "I know you're off the clock, but would you join me for dinner tomorrow? It's special." Grace tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "Special how?" Nathan hesitated, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You'll see," he said with a faint smile. "Just trust me." Grace's stomach fluttered as she nodded. "Okay." The next evening, Nathan arrived to pick Grace up. She had never seen him so relaxed. His usual sharp demeanor softened into something warmer. He didn't take her to a fancy restaurant or a corporate event. Instead, he brought her to a small, private garden lit with soft fairy lights. A single table stood at the center, set for two. Grace was speechless. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan led her to the table, pulling out her chair. "This," he said, sitting across from her, "is where I wanted to tell you something important." Grace's heart pounded as Nathan reached into his pocket. When he pulled out the diamond ring, her breath caught. "This belonged to my mother," Nathan began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "She always said it should go to someone who truly understood its value, not just the monetary worth, but what it represents: integrity, kindness, and strength." He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "Grace, you've shown me all of that and more. You've reminded me of what truly matters in life. You've given me hope in a way I didn't think was possible." Grace's eyes filled with tears as Nathan knelt before her, holding out the ring. "I'm not just asking you to wear this," he said softly. "I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal, and the person I build my life with." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. Her thoughts raced, and every doubt she had ever felt rose to the surface. But then, she looked at Nathan, really looked at him, and saw nothing but sincerity in his eyes. "I'm not sure I'm worthy of this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathan shook his head. "Grace, you're more than worthy. You're extraordinary." Grace's lips trembled as she nodded. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I'll marry you." Nathan slid the ring onto her finger, his own eyes glistening. The diamond sparkled under the garden lights, a symbol of a future they would build together. As they embraced, Grace felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of belonging. Grace and Nathan's union became more than just a love story. It became a symbol of hope for everyone around them. Together, they transformed Callaway Industries into a company that prioritized its employees' well-being. They implemented programs to support underprivileged workers, offering scholarships for their children, financial assistance for medical needs, and better wages for all. Grace took an active role in these initiatives, ensuring that the struggles she had faced would no longer be the norm for others. She remained humble, her quiet strength inspiring everyone she met. Nathan, too, changed. The man who once viewed the world through the lens of profit and loss now saw it through the eyes of kindness and integrity. He often said, "Grace didn't just return my ring, she gave me back my purpose." The diamond ring, once a symbol of Nathan's mother's legacy, now carried a new meaning. It represented two lives that had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances and the unshakable bond they had built together. Years later, as Grace stood on stage at a company event, her hand clasped in Nathan's, she looked out at the employees she had once worked alongside. Her voice was steady as she said, "Kindness and integrity may not seem like much in a world that values power and wealth, but they're everything. They're the foundation of a life worth living." The applause that followed wasn't just for her, it was for the message that had changed so many lives. Grace's story is a reminder. Our greatest acts of courage are often the quietest. Integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when it's easy, it's about standing by your values when it costs you the most. If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on the power of small, honest actions. Remember, every choice matters, and the right one can change everything. And if you'd like more stories that inspire, challenge, and move you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration.